vast surface seen from a great height. It gleamed dully like frozen mercury. Incredibly slender needles stood upon it at regular intervals, like pieces on a chessboard, stalagmites immaculately white, sharply pointed and growing. Or rather they issued upward, wrapped at their bases in golden spider-webs, until that motion ceased. On the far horizon, completely cloudless, birds flew, each bird having four independently moving wings. They must have been huge. They flew like cranes migrating from northern climes. Below, at the stalagmites, now recognizable to human eyes as rockets, tiny things shimmered. Dark and multicolored, they swarmed up wide ramps into the white ships. Everyone leaned forward, straining his eyes to see, finally, what the Quintons looked like, but with no more success than a visitor from Neptune would have had, trying to make out the human form by scrutinizing a packed Olympic stadium from a mile away. The variegated, churning crowd continued to gather at the bottom of the ramps and to disappear in rivers inside the ships as bright as snow. On the hulls were perpendicular rows of hieroglyphics, shining, illegible inscriptions. The crowd now thinned, and everyone waited for the inevitable take-off, that white flotilla. But slowly, majestically, it began to sink. The gold-bronze spiderwebs fell away from the hulls, as if rotted through, making irregular circles on the ground. Now only the white prows jutted above the lake of flat mercury, and then they too entered dark red wells, and no trapdoors of hatches closed over them, only that same matte mercury. The plain was featureless. From the edge of the screen slowly crawled a centipede, clearly mechanical, not a living creature, with a flat, truncated snout. From the snout poured a fountain of bright yellowish fluid, which spread and at the same time bubbled as if boiling. When the stuff had all boiled away, the mercury turned black as tar. The centipede bent back, arching, so that its middle legs hung in midair. It turned directly toward the marching men, and opened four eyes. Or were they windows, or spotlights? But they looked like the large eyes of a fish, round, surprised, with thin-banded metallic irises and black, glittering pupils. This robot vehicle seemed to regard them thoughtfully with concern out of those four pupils, which were now no longer round but had narrowed like a cat's. At the same time something flickered, weak blue in their centers. Then the centipede fell, resuming its position on the black ground, and swaying from side to side like a real centipede, trotted out of the field of vision. There were no more birds in the sky, only the caption. Our spaceport, we accept your arrival, continuation follows. The continuation indeed followed. First with a thunderstorm. The downpour lashed a row of buildings with slanting rain, buildings connected by a multitude of overhead viaducts. A peculiar city in a cloudburst. The water coursed down oval roofs, poured from spouts at the bases of bridges, yet those were not bridges, they were tunnels with elliptic windows, and in their centers rushed streaks of fluttering light. An elevated railroad? Not a soul anywhere the length of the streets, but because the buildings were in a cascade arrangement, like the Toltecan pyramids cast in metal, there really were no streets. It was impossible to determine the ground level of the city, if this was in fact a city. The rain, whipped by the wind, drove in sheets of silver across gigantic structures. Lightning struck without a sound, and from the pyramids the water streamed in a curious way. The gutters that collect it were raised at the end, so that great torrents flew into the air and merged with the ever-pouring rain. But then one of the lightning bolts split up and froze into words of fire. Storms are on our planet frequent phenomenon. The image dimmed and went out. In a dingy grayness appeared outlines, broken silhouettes. Somewhere in the depths a shuddering amalgamation of fire and clouds or smoke, layer upon layer of rubble of enormous structures. In the foreground lay a whitish blotches, as of the naked bodies of creatures torn apart, smeared with mud in even rows. Above this vast cemetery, the color of iron, flashed the words, "The city was destroyed by your selenoclasm." The inscription vanished, and the picture wandering among the ruins, showing close-ups of incomprehensible mechanisms. One of these, reinforced all around with unusually thick metal, had been cracked open, and inside, here a telephoto lens zooming in, where again mangled remains, providing no clue as to the shape of what had lived, like human corpses pulled from mass graves, half rags and clay. Then the camera, retreating suddenly, Again, a great expanse of rubble with deep excavations. In them, like beetles, squat bulldozers streaked with red gnawed at the debris, their mandibles working. The bulldozers pushed stubbornly, with difficulty ramming the center of a split facade, white as alabaster, as milk, but singed by flame until the wall crumbled and dust lifted in a rust-red cloud, blocking out the scene. For a few moments all that could be heard in the control room was rapid breathing and the tick of a second hand. The screen brightened. A strange diadem appeared, of crystal as transparent as a tear, with a hollow knot made for any human skull, and corums sparkling like diamonds. Set in it, compact, a dodecahedron, a pale pink spinel. Above this, the inscription, crowning conclusion, but it was not the conclusion. Against a harsh halogen light, there were dark, headless crustaceans on the gentle slope of a mountainside, like a herd of cattle grazing in an alpine pasture. In vain did the eye try to identify them. Were they large tortoises? Giant coleoptera? The picture lifted, went along an increasingly steep wall of rock with black recesses, grottos, caves. It was not water that flowed from them, but perhaps a slurry, a brown-yellow vomitus. And then, on a purple, gently undulating background, words began to march. We accept your arrival ship of Brest, mass limit 300,000 tons metric at spaceport AAO-35. As shown, give time, we guarantee your peace forgetting by your cylindrical projection of Mercator Meridian 135 parallel 48. We await your signal announcement arrival. The monitor went blank. Daylight flooded the control room. The second pilot, very pale, his hands unconsciously pressed to his chest, still stared at the empty screen. Harak struggled with himself. Large beads of sweat trickled down the man's forehead and rested on his thick blond brows. It's blackmail, he blurted. To put the blame on us for that. Tempeh started, as if suddenly awakened. But you know, he said quietly, it's true. Did anyone invite us here? We landed smack in the middle of their misfortune to increase it. Enough of that, Harak snapped. If you must do penance, go to that priest of yours. Don't try converting me. It's not only blackmail, it's more cunning. Yes, I can see how they'd love to get us on their hook. Use your head, Mark. That wasn't our fault. It was they who— Use your head. Tempeh got up, unable to sit still. No matter how the game ends, what we did, we did. Contact between intelligences, my God. If you have to curse someone, then curse SETI, curse CETI, curse the day you decided to become a psychozoic discoverer. Better yet, keep your mouth shut. That's the smartest thing you can do. That afternoon, the open sesame containing the landers was pulled on board. Arago asked Steerguard for a general meeting to discuss future courses of action. Steerguard refused point blank. There would be no meetings, no councils, until the final phase of the program was completed. Adorned with a gamma laser, the fake Hermes disappeared behind the curve of Sexta and made full speed for Quinta, exchanging with it the prearranged sign and countersign. As soon as he was off duty, Tempeh tried to see the captain. The captain refused. Alone in his cabin, he was seeing no one. The pilot rode down to the middle level. He hadn't the nerve to go to the monk, but turned back halfway and asked on the intercom for Gerbert, who was not in his room. Gerbert was in the mess hall with Kirsting and Nakamura. The ship maneuvered to provide a little thrust. They remained in shadow and had weak gravitation. At the sight of people eating, Tempeh realized that he had not put a thing into his mouth since dawn. He joined them, silent, with a plate of roast beef and rice, but when he touched the meat with his fork, he became, for the first time in his life, nauseous because of the meat's grayish fibers. He had to eat, however, so he scraped his plate into the kitchen back and took from the automat an instant-heated vitamin porridge, to fill his stomach with something. No one spoke to him. It was only when he had tossed his plate and spoon into the washer that Nakamura, with a faint smile, called him over. Tempeh sat down opposite the Japanese, who wiped his lips with a paper napkin. When Kirsting left, when the two of them were alone with Gerbert, Nakamura cocked his head in the way he had, his black hair combed flat, and looked expectantly at the pilot. The pilot shrugged, which meant that he had nothing to say. Nothing. When we turn our backs on the world does not go away, said the physicist suddenly. Where there is mind, there is also cruelty. They go together. One should accept this, since it cannot be changed. And why is the captain seeing no one? the pilot said. He is entitled, the Japanese replied, unruffled. The captain, like all of us, must save face. When he is alone, too. Dr. Gerbert suffers. Our pilot Tempeh suffers. But I do not suffer. As for Father Arago, I don't even want to think about Father Arago. How is it that you don't suffer? Tempeh didn't understand. I don't have the right, Nakamura calmly explained. Modern physics demands an imagination that shrinks from nothing. It is no credit to me. It is a gift of my predecessors. I am not a prophet, not a clairvoyant. I am merely objective when it is necessary to be objective. Otherwise, I, too, would be unable to eat meat. Who was it that said, Nemo me pune nacit? Does he now regret his words? The pilot paled. No. Good, your buddy Harak is putting on quite a show, the mask of fury fixed on his face, like a demon in our kabuki theater. One should be neither angry nor despairing, neither feel pity nor seek revenge, and you yourself now know why. Or am I mistaken? No, said Tempeh. It's that we don't have the right. Exactly. The conversation is concluded. In 30, he consulted his watch, in 37 hours the Hermes will be landing. Who is on duty then? Both of us. Orders. You won't be alone. Nakamura rose, nodded to them, and left. In the empty mess hall, the washer hissed softly, and there was a light breeze from the air conditioning. The pilot glanced at the physician, who continued to sit motionless, his head in his hands staring into space. Tempeh left the man there without exchanging a word with him. There was nothing really to say. The landing of the Hermes turned out to be spectacular. Descending toward the designated point on the planet, it belched such fire from its stern that the burn, transmitted by the myriads of tiny eyes dispersed in space, entered the milky fullness of the clouds like an incandescent needle, tearing it apart beneath into a whirl of pinkening scuds. Into this window, the hole cleared by flame, the ship sank, then disappeared. Wisps of feathery cirrocumuli, spiraling inward, began to close the breach in Quinta's cloud cover, but they had not yet filled it when a yellow light burst up through them. After 9 minutes, the time required for a signal to travel the distance separating the two observers from the planet, the transmitter of the fake Hermes, aimed at Sexta, beamed for the first and last time. The clouds once again parted in that place, but more gradually, gently. In the control room full of people, there was a sound like a short stifled sigh. Steerguard, the unblemished, white face of Quinta at his back, called Deuce. Give me an analysis of the explosion. I have only the emission spectrum. Give the cause of the explosion based on that spectrum. It will be uncertain. I know. Go ahead. Very well. 4 seconds after the drive was shut off, the reactor core blew up. Should I give the cause variance? Yes. Sent a stream of neutrons at a high-low frequency designed to penetrate the housing of the pile, struck the stern. The reactor, though shut off, began functioning as an amplifier, and an exponential chain reaction is triggered in the plutonium. The second variant, the armor plate at the stern, was pierced by a cumulative charge with a cold anomalon warhead. Should I give the reasoning behind the first variant? Go ahead. An attack of the ballistic type would demolish the entire ship. A neutron blow, on the other hand, could knock out just the power source, if the assumption is that there are biological creatures on board, and that they will be separated, therefore, from the engine area by radiation-proof shielding. Should I show the spectra? No, enough. Only now did Steerguard notice that he was standing on the white light of Quinta as in a halo. Without looking, he turned off the picture and was silent for a moment, seeming to digest the words of the machine. Does anyone wish to take the floor? Nakamura raised his eyebrows and slowly, with great gravity, as if formally offering condolences, said, I stand behind the first hypothesis. The ship was to have lost power while the crew emerged from the attack in one piece, with injuries but alive. One cannot learn much from corpses. Who disagrees? Asked the captain. All were silent, not so much because of what happened and what had been said, as because of the look on Steerguard's face. Hardly opening his mouth, as if seized with lockjaw, he said, Come, Dubs, you champions of peace and mercy, speak up, give us, and give them, a chance to be saved. Convince me that we should go back, bringing Earth small consolation that there exist worlds worse than ours, and leaving them to their own doom. For the duration of such persuading, I cease to be your captain. I am the grandson of a Norwegian fisherman. I am a simple man who has overreached himself. I will listen to any and all arguments, to insults too, if someone considers that necessary. What I hear will be erased from Deuce's memory. Go ahead. This is not humility, this is sarcasm. The symbolic resignation from your position of captain does not change the fact. Arago, as if wanting to be better heard, stepped forward from the rest. But if each man is to act according to his conscience to the end, whether he is in a drama or a black comedy, because he did not choose the play himself and does not know his lines by heart like an actor, then I say this: killing, we save no one, we save nothing. Deception lay behind the mask of the Hermes, and it lies behind the mask of seeking contact at any price. The thirst is not for knowledge but for vengeance. Whatever you do, if you do not retreat, will result in a fiasco. And retreat would not constitute a fiasco? No, replied Arago. You know with certainty that you can bloody them, but you know nothing else with certainty. That is true. Are you finished, father? Who else wishes to speak? I do. It was Harak. If you decide to retreat, Captain, I will do everything in my power to prevent it. You will have to blind me hand and foot. I know that according to Deuce I've become abnormal. All right, but we are, every one of us here, abnormal. We did all we possibly could to convince them that we presented no threat. For 4 months we let ourselves be attacked, lured, betrayed, and if Father Arago represents Rome here, then let him remember that his Saviour said to Matthew, I came not to send peace but a sword. And but I've talked too much. Do we vote? No. 5 hours have passed since their disappointment. We cannot delay. El Salam, you will start up the Solazer. Without warnings? It's a bit late in the day for that. How much time do you need? 16 minutes back and forth for the sign and countersign, plus positioning. It can fire in 20 minutes. Fire away. By the program? Yes, for an hour. Nakamura, let's have the viewer. Whoever doesn't want to watch can leave. Well hidden in the mask's dust cloud, whose radiance was induced by Zeta, the Solazer opened fire at 1 in the morning, a 3-hour delay because Steerguard wanted perfect collimation. To hit the ring along its tangent at the exact point where the trap had been set for them, it was necessary to wait for the planet to rotate into position. 18 terajoules shot out in a sword of light. The jump in the photometers showed that the solar blade, invisible in empty space, had traveled sideways. Brushing the edge of the ring, it peeled off the outer rim. The scene, though it was deaf and dumb and an outstretched palm could easily have covered it, that demonstrated the full power taken from the sun when that power was released in the collision between the light, harder than steel, and the circle of ice spread over thousands of miles. The center of the blow they saw first a sparkling gap out of which poured a blizzard of swelling white clouds, laced with unusual trembling, arching rainbows. The ice ring boiled, steamed, and turning to gas, immediately froze and scattered into the void beyond the conflagration, making a long, streaming veil that trailed the planet. It then set behind the disk, since the laser was striking in the direction opposite to the rotation. Steerguard had ordered the slanted, gleaming ring to be hit in such a way as to pry it out of its dynamic equilibrium. The power packed inside the Solazer was sufficient for 7 minutes of terajoule surgery. One target, said Deuce. The outer ring was already breaking up. The inner ring, separated from it by a space 600 miles wide, was alive with turbulence caused by the changes in the angular momentum. When the circle of ice sweeping toward the darkness reached with its long-maned clouds beyond the day-side hemisphere and disappeared in the shadow of the night side, Quinto's horizon shone as though behind it there rose a second, twin sun through pillars of smoke and rainbows, a sun that cast a smooth blood-red glow on the curved sea of clouds. The view of this terrible catastrophe was magnificent. The light caught in trillions of ice crystals from the butchered ring produced a cosmic fireworks that dimmed every constellation in the starry sky. It was breathtaking. The people in the projection room instinctively shifted their eyes from the upper monitor, in which an eccentric laser diamond trembled just above the sun, to the main screen where a constant unpulsed beam of power stripped fractured slabs, snow-white flows from the circle of ice. Could they have anticipated such a cataclysm? From the planet it must have looked like an uncanny, unending explosion high in the heavens, but they were probably unable to see the rainbows shooting upward like lightning bolts because billions of ice fragments already were hurtling down on them. Mountains of ice, seething and thundering, fell from tattered clouds, but this was no thrilling sight for the ones who perished beneath that roaring avalanche. Seen from the projection room, the atmosphere that encircled the planet was an extremely thin layer. The great magnitude of this astro-engineered amputation could be seen safely only by the inhabitants of the tropical regions until a shockwave reached them, faster than sound. The photon beam, moving millimeter by millimeter at the muzzle of the solar laser, crushed plains of ice hundreds of miles across at the target. Only at the planet's southernmost point was there nothing yet to show the fury of the broken disk, which every minute shed hundreds of cubic kilometers of shattered ice. Now, within a cloud thrust high above the atmosphere, the laser beam became visible. It struck in the heart of the cloud like a well of fire. The spectrometers now recorded not churning steam, but ionized free oxygen and hydroxyl radicals. In the control room, the minutes became an eternity. The ring, wobbling like a cracked top, lost its clear shine, was riddled by dark holes. The northern hemisphere began to swell as if the planetary crust itself were being inflated, but it was only that the impact of the ice debris was throwing air, fire, and snow out into space. At the equator, the laser beam, a drill of blue-white heat along the tangent, bored persistently into a mushroom-shaped explosion until the cloud cover of Quinta darkened to a dull pearl plain in the west, while the east blazed in jutting eruptions toward the stars. No one spoke. Recalling those minutes later, they realized they had expected a counterattack. They had expected that they would at least try to somehow to parry the blow falling on the very heart of the war sphere that had taken a century to build. That the Quintans even now were readying themselves to strike at the source of the cataclysm, visible against the face of the sun, since it was 5 times as bright. But nothing happened. Above the planet there rose, wider than the planet, a column of smoky white dust. It spread into a many-lobed mushroom covered with continually splitting rainbows, cruelly beautiful, and the cutting beams still stabbed through layers of mist like an incandescent wire of gold taut between the sun and the planet. The planet itself seemed to veil its face gradually with distended cirrocumuli, as if in self-defense against the incredibly thin and yet so destructive ray which jabbed at the remaining shards of ice as they sank into the atmosphere. Then it was only at moments from between the swollen clouds that there were glints of the remnants of the ring still orbiting in its death agony. Steerguard ordered the solar laser shut off after the 6th minute. He wanted to keep its remaining power in reserve. The solar laser went out as abruptly as it had flashed on and let them know in the infrared that it was changing its position. Locating it was simple, elementary, even when it was extinguished, because of the Planck spectrum, typical of stationary bodies forced to radiate by the proximity of the chromosphere. So the girders ejected from small throwers a dust that burned in the sun, and the solar laser carried out its move behind this screen, folding up into the shape of a closed fan. Deuce worked at top capacity. It recorded the results of the blow, the fate of countless satellites that climbed from lower orbits into an atmosphere expanded by explosions and died there in fiery parabolas. At the same time, Deuce informed them that the copy of the Hermes could also have been crushed by a magnetodyne attack in field concentrations on the order of 1 billion Gauss. Deuce had a fourth hypothesis as well, involving implosive cryotronic bombs. The captain instructed it to file those data in the archives. They were still in stationary orbit when the shadow of Sexta, then Steerguard, summoned Nakamura and Polisar to present them with a handwritten ultimatum. For its transmission, they were to use the holographic eyes. These would be burned out by emitting so strong a signal that Steerguard was willing to pay that price. The ultimatum was straightforward. Your ring was destroyed in response to the attack on our ship. We are giving you 48 hours. If you attack us or fail to answer, we will 1. Sweep away your atmosphere, and 2. Initiate a planetoclasm operation. If, however, you receive our envoy and he returns unharmed to our ship, we will refrain from steps 1 and 2. That is all. The Japanese asked the captain if he was actually prepared to blast the atmosphere. For the cavitation of the planet, he added, they lacked the power. I know, I'm not sweeping away the atmosphere. I'm counting on their brief that I will. As for using the side reels, I'd like to hear Polisar's opinion. Even behind an empty threat, there should stand some real force. Polisar's reply came reluctantly. It would put a dangerous overload on the side reels. We could pierce the mantle. If we disturb the foundation of this continental plates, the biosphere perishes. Bacteria and algae survive. Is this worth discussing? No, that's enough. Both felt it was necessary to learn the scope of the catastrophe, which was extremely difficult. Holes in Quinta's envelope of noise indicated that hundreds of transmitting stations had been knocked out, but without an SG it was impossible to determine, even approximately, the extent of the damage to the technological infrastructure on the large continent. The effects of the cataclysm now began to take their toll in the southern hemisphere on other continents. Seismic activity increased violently. On the sea of clouds appeared dark patches. All the volcanoes must have been belching magma with gases containing cyanide. Deuce estimated the mass of the ice that had reached the surface of the ground in the oceans to be between 3 and 4 trillion tons. The northern hemisphere had suffered much greater devastation than the southern, but the ocean had risen everywhere and invaded all coastal regions. Deuce cautioned that it could not determine how many fragments of the ring had fallen to the planet in solid form, and how many had been melted, for this depended on the exact size of the ice chunks, which was unknown. If they exceeded 1,000 tons, they lost only a small fraction of their mass in the densest layers of air, but Deuce was unable to give a definite denominator. Harak, who was only on duty at the controls, was not part of the conversation that went on in the projection room above his head, but he heard it and unexpectedly broke in. "Captain, could I say something?" "What now?" Steergard was irritated. "It wasn't enough for you? You'd like to grind them to a pulp?" "No, if Deuce is speaking the truth, 48 hours won't suffice. They'll need to pull themselves together. You've joined the Doves too late," snapped Steergard. But the physicist agreed that the pilot had a point. The deadline for answering has moved to 70 hours. Shortly afterward, Harak found himself alone. He put the controls on automatic. He had had his fill of looking at Quinta, particularly since the reddish smoke from the innumerable volcanic eruptions had spread over the churning white of the planet and darkened to a dirty brown like clotted blood. It was not blood, he knew that, but did not want to watch it. In accordance with Steergard's orders, the ship began revolving in place like the outstretched arm of a pivoting crane which provided them with a makeshift gravity. Thanks to the centrifugal force felt most strongly in the control room at the prow. In the mess hall, where the crew now gathered, the rotation enabled one to sit at a table without the acrobatics of weightlessness. The processional effects characteristic of a gyroscope made Harak sick to his stomach, even though he had sailed often on Earth, and the worst pitching and yawning never brought on nausea. He could not sit. What he had desired had come to pass. Looking at it rationally, he bore no responsibility for the cataclysm. He was certain that everything would have transpired the same, even if he had not flown into a rage or got into those pointless arguments with poor blameless Arago. No, nothing would have been different had the mind to his own business and kept his mouth shut. He jumped up from his seat at the controls to stretch his legs, but then was driven to pace the navigation area back and forth. There was no other outlet for his anger, which kept returning to him like an echo, pressing him not to wait, not to sit with folded hands. So I looked at the climatic disturbances, if only they were just climatic, of the stricken planet. He would gladly have switched off the image, but was not allowed to do that. The ellipsoid interior of the room was ringed by a railed walk that separated the upper level from the lower, staggering on feet wide apart, like a sailor on a heaving deck. He ran up and jogged around and around the gallery. One might have thought that the man was taking up exercise on an indoor track. On girders that came together like the spokes of a great wheel between cross braces secured to the ceiling was the center of operations. Deep, velcroed chairs surrounded a terminal that was a low truncated cone. At its sides, in front of each chair, flickered an empty green screen. On the cone table lay the discarded draft of the ultimatum, in Steergard's characteristically sharp-angled handwriting. Moving between the chairs, Harak did a thing no one ever would have expected of him. He turned the paper over, the written side down, and glanced around to see if anyone was watching. But only the flickering screens mimicked motion. He sank into the chair usually occupied by the captain and looked in both directions. Between the girded supports, silvery plastic, were wedge-shaped windows opening downward, through which he could see the navigation area, also flickering with tiny lights of various colors, and the glare that came steadily from the main screen. The dull light of Quinta. Hawk put his elbows on the slanted console and buried his face in his hands. Had he been able, he would have sobbed for this Sodom and Gomorrah. The Quentins. He appeared calm. He did not say goodbye to anyone. None of his comrades got into the elevator with him when it was time. In an ordinary white spacesuit with the helmet tucked under his arm, he watched the sequentially flashing numerals of the passing levels. The door opened by itself. In the high-domed launch chamber stood a surprisingly small rocket of spotless silver, having not yet traveled through an atmosphere whose heat would blacken its prow and sides. He approached it, past open-worked metal that gave a muffled echo to his steps, and he felt an increase in weight, a sign that the Hermes was accelerating to provide him with a good push at takeoff. He looked around. High up at the intersection of the curved girders was a ring of strong fluorescent lights. He paused in their shadowless glare to put on his helmet. The cabin hatchway opened above him. The buckles pulled tight, clicked. Automatically, he touched the wide rim of the metal collar and inhaled oxygen. He was now cut off from the air that filled the chamber. The pressure was a little high, but it corrected itself immediately. The platform onto which he stepped rose. The hatchway, dark a moment before, lit up from within, and the moving platform touched his threshold and stopped. Without haste, lifting his large boots across the threshold, he moved his flexible glove along the tube of the handrail, bent down, and eased himself in feet first. With both hands, he swung from the grips on the transom and lightly dropped inside. The hatchway closed. A growing musical whistling could be heard. It was the gas-tight hood that had been suspended above the rocket, but now fell onto it. Hydraulic pistons pressed the hood to the casing of a propulsion funnel so that the ship would not lose air on takeoff or be poisoned by the flaming exhaust of the engines. Easily, as if in a simulator, he took the ribbed hoses of the heating-cooling system and fit them into the appropriate sockets of his suit. The catches snapped immediately, showing that the couplings were engaged. He was now connected to the rocket. Its wall padding began to inflate and inflated until he was totally enveloped, swaddled, but only to the armpits, so that he had his hands free. There was no more room than in an Egyptian sarcophagus. These one-man landers had in fact been called coffins. The countdown lever was on his right. Directly in front of his face shone through the glass of the helmet the dashboard, analog dials, digital counters for altitude, power, and artificial horizon, and in the middle a rectangular screen still blank. When he pushed the lever, all the indicator lights flashed on, winking at him in a homey, friendly way, assuring him that everything was ready: the main engine, the 8 correctionals, the 4 retros, the ionosphere loop parachute, and the large emergency one, but the screen with rapidly fading points reassured him that there could be no emergency, drawing a perfect, precise curve of flight from the Hermes, represented by a green asterisk, to the swell of the planet's outline. With a fractional delay, the 3rd parachute, a cascader known as a spare tire, announced its presence. He had experienced such moments before, and savored them. He trusted these little blinking, palpitating lights, green, orange, and blue, knowing that they could flare red like a bloodshot eye in terror, because there was no such thing as a trouble-free device, though everyone had taken great pains to see that nothing could go wrong. The automatic was already counting down from 200. It seemed to him that in the speaker he could hear the breathing of the people assembled in the control room, and that it was against this living background of bated breath that the indifferent, mechanical voice rattled off numbers in decreasing progression. At 10 he felt a slight quickening of the pulse, and frowned as if rebuking his insufficiently disciplined heart. True, almost no one was spared a little tachycardia upon takeoff, even a routine takeoff, but this circumstance was anything but routine. He was glad that no one spoke to him, but when the time-honored 0 was pronounced, and he felt a shudder pass through man and projectile joined into one, a soft voice reached him from someone who evidently stood some distance from the microphones. "God be with you." These words surprised him, although perhaps, who knows, he did expect them from that man. But there was no time now for such reflections. The craft, borne powerfully yet gently by a hydraulic pawl, as if a giant steel hand gloved in satin were pushing it up and out a cylindrical chute, separated from the ship. He could not move in the balloon-like insulation, but weightlessness claimed him for 2 or 3 seconds before the engines began to roar. For an instant he saw the hull of the ship rush by at the upper edge of the monitor, but that might have been his imagination. The rocket, named Earth, as he had requested, did a somersault. The pinpoints of stars flew at an angle across the screen. Quinta swam by among them, a white disk, and disappeared. His craft, sweeping the darkness with bursts from the correctional nozzles, fell on course. The trajectory of its actual flight matched the one plotted by the computer point for point. He ought to have called the Hermes by now, but kept silent, reveling in his solitary flight. "The Hermes awaits your report," That was Steergard. Before he could answer, another voice spoke. Hurrahs. Must have dozed off. Such jokes, having a little of the flavor of barracks humor, had accompanied the first space flights, to lighten the unprecedented experience of men locked in the nose of a rocket as if inside an artillery shell. Thus, Gagarin had said at the last moment what in Russian amounted to Geronimo. Thus one did not say, "There's an oxygen leak. We're suffocating," but "We have a little problem." Harak was probably unaware that with his wisecrack he was following an old tradition, and Tempe, for no good reason, replied with, "Just flying along," but then caught himself and switched to an appropriately professional tone. "Earth here, all units normal. I have Delta Harpier on my axis, entering the atmosphere in 3 hours. Confirm. Over." "Confirmed. Haparia is given the meteorological conditions at point zero, overcast, wind north-northeast at 13 meters a second. Above the spaceport, the ceiling is 900 meters. Visibility good. Want to talk to anyone here?" "No, I'd like to look at Quinta." "You'll see her in 8 minutes, when you reach the ecliptic. Then you'll make a course correction. Over." "I'll make the correction when the Hermes gives the signal. Over. Good luck. Over and out." The negotiations after the destruction of the ice ring had lasted 4 days and nights. The crew dealt only with Haparia, which in fact they did not learn immediately, because the ultimatum was answered by an artificial satellite so small and so well disguised as a fragment of rock that Deuce did not identify it until it spoke. Set in a stationary orbit 42,000 kilometers above the planet, it rotated accordingly, and when it went behind the edge of the disk, communication was broken off for 7 hours. It talked with the Hermes using the 21-centimeter band of hydrogen. The ship's radar had to examine the thing's cisplanetary emission thoroughly before discovering how it severed Haparia as a relay transmitter. A strong underground radio station controlled it, concealed in the vicinity of the spaceport where the unmanned Hermes had so fatefully landed. The station operated on a 10-kilometer wavelength, which gave the physicists reason to suspect that it was a special military installation designed to go into action in the event of a massive exchange of atomic blows. Such an exchange would be accompanied by electromagnetic shock waves disrupting all wireless radio communication, and with a megaton concentrations of explosions at the targets, it would also be futile to use ordinary laser transmitters. Only ultra-long waves would be effective then, but their low information capacity made it impossible to transmit multi-bit messages in a short time. So Steergard aimed the Hermes emitters at this radio station. When it did not respond, he sent the following ultimatum. Either they communicated directly, or in the course of 24 hours he would destroy the whole range of bodies, natural and artificial, that were in stationary orbit, and if even then he received no reply, he would feel justified in raising the temperature of an area 800,000 hectares around the spaceport, including the spaceport, to 12,000 degrees Kelvin, which meant that the planet's crust would be pierced to a depth of a quarter of its radius. The threat worked, although Nakamura and Kirsten tried to dissuade the captain from so drastic a measure, since it would be de facto equivalent to a declaration of war. Interplanetary law ceased to bind us from the moment we were attacked, reported Steergard. Negotiations on kilometer wavelengths, relayed and repeated back and forth, could drag on for months, and behind the purely physical reason for this consuming of time there might be hidden the strategic attempt to delay in order to turn the tables on us. I'm not giving them the chance. If this is an informational exchange of opinions, gentlemen, let's not hear any more about it. But if it's a votum separatum, then enter it in the expedition's log. I will answer for it when I resign my command. In the meantime, I am not resigning. In its counter-proposals, Haparia asked for strict limitations on the envoy's latitude of action. The notion of contact became increasingly nebulous the more precisely they tried to define it. Steergard wanted a face-to-face meeting between his man and representatives of the local government and science. But either the meaning of these concepts was completely skewed between the Quintans and humans, or else here too bad faith had crept in. Tempe flew without knowing whom he would be seeing at the spaceport, but somehow this did not bother him. He was not born on wings of euphoria. He did not count on any great success, and was himself surprised at his calm. During his preparation on the training equipment, he had said to Harak that he did not believe that they would skin him alive. They might be unpitying. One expected that, but they weren't idiots. The negotiations were accompanied by deliberations on board, putting up constant resistance, haggling out point after point. The Quinton side finally obtained conditions for the meeting. The visitor could leave the rocket to inspect the remains of the fake Hermes, and could move freely within a 6-mile radius of his rocket with guaranteed immunity, provided he did not undertake hostile acts or convey to the host side threatening information. Great difficulty was encountered in understanding these terms. The higher the level of abstraction, the more human and Quinton semantics diverged. Such words as authority, neutrality, side, and guarantee did not mean the same thing to both, whether due to some outside factor, such as fundamental difference in their histories, or to intentional dishonesty. But dishonesty even did not necessarily imply a desire to deceive or trick. If, for example, Hyparia, embroiled in a 100-year war, was neither free nor sovereign in this matter, yet did not wish or was not allowed to reveal the fact to the Hermes. A factor here, too, as most of the crew believed, may have been that so many generations of conflict on the planet had a cumulative effect on the way of thinking as well as on the language. The day before takeoff, Nakamura had asked the pilot if they could converse in private. That was how he put it. He began in a roundabout way. Intelligence without courage was worth no more than courage without intelligence. The war, having escalated into space, was undoubtedly intercontinental. It would have been best, therefore, to send equally authorized envoys to both landmasses with prior assurances that they would deliver no military important information to either host. The captain had rejected this variant because he wanted to keep an eye on what happened to the envoy. The ship could not be sent on both sides of the planet at the same time. The captain wanted to impress upon the Quintons his intention of retaliating if the envoy failed to return safe and sound. He did not indicate the extent of that retaliation, a correct tactic, but one that did not give the envoy complete protection. Far be it from Nakamura to criticize the captain. He had asked to talk to the pilot, however, because he considered it to be his duty. As Shakespeare once wrote, it was dangerous for a lesser being to come between the pass and fell incensed points of mighty opposites. There were 3 mighty opposites here, the Hermes, Nostralia, and Hyparia. What did Quintons know? They knew that the intruder enjoyed superiority in both defense and offense, and was able to place blows with great accuracy, in whose interest, in light of this, lay the good health of the envoy. Suppose the envoy's health suffered. Hyparia would claim that he met with an unfortunate accident, while Nostralia would prove that it was no accident. In this way, each would try to deflect the Hermes' retaliatory blow to hit the opposing side. The captain, indeed, had promised a total destruction, though history showed that the Last Judgment was not a workable tool in politics. A couple of Americans in the 20th century had come up with the notion of a doomsday machine, a cobalt superbomb that would blackmail all the nations of Earth with the threat of universal death, but no one followed through with it, and rightly so, because when there was no longer anything to lose, it was impossible to conduct real politics. Apocalypse as a reprisal had little credibility. Why should the Hermes strike the entire planet if there was one kamikaze on Hyparia who made an attempt on the envoy's life? The Japanese's argument sounded convincing to the pilot. Why had it failed to convince the captain? Nakamura, bowing politely to his guest, continued to smile. Because we are without a surefire strategy. The captain does not want to untie the knots. His intention is to hack through them. Humble Nakamura does not raise himself above anyone. He thinks his own Nakamurian thoughts. And what does he think about? About 3 riddles. The first riddle is the sending of the envoy. Will it lead to contact? Only symbolically. If the envoy returns in one piece, having seen the Quintons and learned from them that nothing is to be learned from them, that will be a tremendous accomplishment. The pilot is tempted to laugh. The planet is less accessible than Mount Everest. Although on that famous mountain there is nothing but rock and ice, hundreds of people in the course of many years have risked their lives to stand there, if only for a moment. And those who returned, having climbed to within 200 meters of the summit but no farther, considered themselves defeated, even though the place to which they climbed had no more or less intrinsic value than the place that they had hoped to reach in another few minutes. The mentality of our expedition has become like the mentality of those conquerors of the Himalayas, but this is a riddle with which men come into the world and die, so we have grown accustomed to it. The second riddle for Nakamura is the fate of the pilot. May he safely return, but if something unforeseen occurs, Hyparia will argue that it was white. and Australia that it was black. This contradiction will push our captain from the role of avenger into the role of the judge. Our threat, sufficient to have forced them to accept the envoy, will hang suspended in space. The third riddle is the greatest. It is the invisibility of the Quintons. No attempt on your life may take place. One cannot doubt, on the other hand, that the Quintons absolutely hate the show that they look like. Perhaps they are monstrous in appearance, suggested the pilot. Nakamura still smiled. Symmetry must be observed here. If they are monsters to us, then we are monsters to them. Forgive me, but the idea is childish. If an octopus had an aesthetic sense, the most beautiful woman in the world would be a monster to it. No, the key to this riddle lies beyond aesthetics. Where, then? Asked the pilot. The Japanese had awakened his interest. We discovered points in common between the Quintons and Earthlings within the technological military context. That commonality leads us to a crossroads. Either they are like us, or they are monsters of evil. Such a crossroads is a fiction, but it is a fact, not a fiction, that they do not want us to become acquainted with their appearance. Why? Nakamura inclined his head in commiseration. If I knew that, the knot would be untied, and our colleague Polasar would not now have the side reels. I'll hazard only one foggy guess. The Japanese imagination differs from that of the West. Deep in the tradition of my country there is the mask. I think that the Quintons, resisting our aims with all their might, i.e. they don't want humans on their planet nevertheless from the beginning, took that eventuality into account. You still don't see the connection? You may behold the Quintons without knowing that you have beheld them. We, on the other hand, beamed cartoons to the planet which featured heroes in human form. I cannot give you courage, Mark. You have more of that already than you need. I can only offer you one piece of advice. He stopped, then said without a smile, enunciating slowly, I advise humility, not caution, nor that you should be confident. I advise humility, that is the readiness to admit that everything, and I mean everything, that you will see may be completely other than it seems. End of conversation. It was only when he was in flight that Tempeh guessed the reproach hidden in Nakamura's words. It was Tempeh and his cartoons that had revealed to the Quintons what humans looked like. But perhaps it was not a reproach after all. These thoughts were interrupted by the rising of the planet. Its innocently white face, wreathed with snowy cirri, and showing no trace of the ice ring or the catastrophe, gently swam through the void, pushing the blackness and the pale dust of the stars out of the frame of the screen. At the same time, the range finder began flashing numbers with a rapid chatter. Along the coast of Australia, jagged with fords, a cold front moved in a flat bank of clouds from the north. Hyparia, meanwhile, was visible, greatly foreshortened. At the eastern bulge of the globe, it lay beneath a darker gloom, and only its polar skyline gleamed with peaks of ice. The Hermes informed him that in 28 minutes he would touch the atmosphere, and it had him make a small course correction. From the control room, Gerbert and Kirsting monitored Tempeh's heart, lungs, and functional brain currents, and in the navigation area, the captain, Nakamura, and Polasar watched the rocket to intervene in the event of an emergency. Although there was no clear idea what form an emergency might take, or an intervention, the fact that the chief physicist and the chief energeticist stood ready at Stergaard's side strengthened the buoyant mood, the tension notwithstanding, on board the ship. The trailing telescopes gave a ship image of the silver spindle that was the Earth, adjusting their magnification so that the rocket remained in the center of the milky disk of Quinta. Finally, Deuce threw orange numerals onto the atmospheric monitor, empty until now. The craft was 200 kilometers above the ocean in rarefied gases, and beginning to heat up. Its tiny shadow fell upon the sea of clouds and sped across their immaculately white surface. The Earth's computer transmitted in a salvo of impulses the last data of the flight. Because in a moment or two the cushion of friction-produced plasma in a thicker layer of air would cut off all communication. A golden spark marked the Earth's entry into the ionosphere. The light grew and spread. The pilot was now braking with his retros. The shadow disappeared as the rocket plunged into the clouds. After 12 minutes, the cesium clocks of projected time in real time dropped to the single digits, whereupon the spectrograph tracking the exhaust flame of the lander, went blank, and after a row of zeros displayed the last classic word, Brindschluss. The Hermes moved high above Quinta to keep the point of the landing directly below it in its nadir. The main observation screen was filled with an impenetrable barrier of clouds. As was agreed, the hosts sprayed masses of metallic dust into the cloud cover above the area, creating a shield that blocked all radiolocation. Steerguard had finally accepted this condition, reserving the right, however, to take drastic measures if so much as one of the laser flashes that Tippe was supposed to send every 100 minutes failed to reach the Hermes. In order to provide the pilot with some visibility at the final stage of landing, the physicists had equipped his rocket with an additional selection filled with gaseous compound of silver and free radicals of ammonia under high pressure. When the craft penetrated the stratosphere and stabbed it from the stern with a fiery mane that flapped up along the sides toward the prow, this ring-shaped section surrounding the funnels of jets was blasted free with explosive charges. Preceding the vehicle, it came into contact with the flame and plasma and burst open from the heat. The violently expanding gases swirled like the funnel of a tornado. With a thunderous rush, cleared a ragged, wide vortex in the heavy clouds. At the same time, liquid oxygen, pumped from the nozzles instead of the hypergol, extinguished the plasma cushion, and the rocket, descending on a cold drive, regained its vision. Through the heat-resistant lenses of the cameras appeared the landing field, encircled by swollen storm clouds. He saw the gray quadrilateral surface of a spaceport cut off on the north by slopes, as of hills, and rimmed on the remaining sides by a multitude of red sparks that trembled in the curving air above them like candle flames smoking. It was these that spouted the streams of metallic dust. The exploded ammonium ions and silver were accomplishing their purpose, to dissolve the last clouds above the landing field in terrain. There was such a downpour that the smoking crimson sparks darkened for a few minutes, darkened but did not go out. Once again they flared in dirty puffs of steam. Looking to the south through the vapors driven apart by the whirlwind, he saw a black structure like a flattened octopus of squid, with many branchings of shiny strips. The strips were neither conduits nor roads. They were concave and transversely striated. The impression of an octopus might also have come from the single Polypherian eye that regarded him from the structure with a sharp, luminous stare, an enormous optic paraboloid, perhaps, that was tracking his descent. As he descended, the greenery of the northern hills beyond the field took on a different aspect. What from a great height had seemed a steep forested massif with a rectangular concrete slab carved out by leveling robots lost the appearance of foliage. It was not the crowns of trees that merged to form a dark green shaggy surface, but dry, lifeless, bush-like tangles of grotesque barbed wire, or knotted tubes of some type, or cables, forced to abandon the image of a wooded hillside, where the light of occasional clearings shone through a gray silvery mass of conifer needles. He saw the artifact of an alien technology whose skill renounced all earthly canons. Were men to have landscaped the area around a spaceport in a wide valley between a metropolis and mountainsides, they would have given care to the arrangement of the terrain, uniting utility with the aesthetics of geometry. They most definitely would not have covered the bare slopes with a jungle of thousands of wildly branching metal gnarls and knots, which, moreover, could not have been the work of engineers masking military targets under a web of pseudo-vegetation, since the unnaturalness of such camouflage would have betrayed itself immediately. When the rocket, on cold drive, fell lower toward the gray concrete runway, the whole bank of hills shrouded by the influx of returning clouds vanished and limbed like a spiny lizard skin, spotted with eruptions with pustules. But before that strange hideousness could cause him to ponder the difference between designing technological devices and releasing them into a self-directed mutating growth, and before he could look again at the structure to the south, the squid already sinking on the horizon, watching him with a luminous eye set in black. He had to take over the controls. The 4Gs fell to 2. Compressed oxygen spurted in an icy boil from the nozzles, and the anthropod legs emerged, flexing, spreading beneath the stern. When they struck the hard ground, the engine gave a final belch and fell silent. The 300-ton rocket executed a few diminishing shifts of position on its undercarriage and then was completely still. He felt in his gut the presence of a weight other than that of the deceleration. Hearing the fading hiss of the shock absorbers, he unbuckled his belts, let the air out of the impact cushions around the suit, and stood up. The straps slid from his shoulders and chest. The atmosphere analyzer showed the presence of no poisonous gases, and the pressure came to 1100 millibars. But he was supposed to go out helmeted, so he connected the oxygen hose to his own tank. When the cameras were switched off, the cabin lights brightened. He ran an eye over what he had brought with him. On either side of the seat lay a heavy, wheeled container that could be pulled like a cart. Harak had painted on these with much solicitude an enormous 1 and 2, as if they might be confused. Harak definitely envied them, but showed no sign of it. A good comrade, Harak was, and the pilot wished that the man was at his side now. The two of them, perhaps, could better cope with the task. Long before the flight, when there were only the words of Lager on the Eurydice to assure him that he would see the Quintons, he had fallen into a depression which Deuce observed, but after his conversation with the doctor, Timpey rejected the machine's diagnosis. It was not his belief that the communication with the Quintons was senseless, based on false assumptions. It was not that which oppressed him, but the fact that they had entered into a game of contact where violence was the highest suit. This thought he kept to himself because more than anything he wanted to see the Quintons. How could he, despite all his reservations and doubts, turn his back on such an opportunity? Arago had taken a dim view of their policy even before the phrase show of strength came up. Arago had called the lie a lie, had repeated that they were entering into a contest of deceit, that they were pushing so forcibly toward communication that they were actually abandoning it, that they were covering themselves with masks and stratagems, safer thereby, perhaps, but more and more removed from any genuine opening up of a view into an alien intelligence. They jumped upon Quinta's subterfuges, struck at Quinta's every refusal, and made the goal of the expedition the less attainable the more brutal the blows they used in its attainment. He activated the hatchway door, but had to wait for the results of the analyses. While his computer chewed the incoming data on the chemical composition of the ground, the force of the wind, the ambient radiation practically zero. He thought not of the next stages of the program, but of all the bad things that he had suppressed until now. Nakamura was of the monk's opinion, but did not go over to his opinion, which meant retreat. Timpey, too, felt that Father Arago was right. Yet right and wrong could not deter him. If Quinta was a hell, Timpey was ready to descend to that hell to see the Quintons. So far true, the reception did not seem hellish. Wind, 9 meters a second, visibility beneath the cloud ceiling, good. No poisons, mines, or charges beneath the surface of the landing field. Searched with ultrasound. There was a whistle. The cabin pressure was being equalized with that of the outside. 3 green bulbs lit up over the hatchway. The heavy lid made half a turn and sprang upward. He heard the scrape of the lowering ladder and the click with which its section stiffened at an angle against the concrete. He looked out. Full daylight hit him through the glass of the helmet. From his height of 4 stories, he saw the vast plain of the spaceport beneath once more, a cloud-covered sky. The northern hills had vanished in mist. In the distance, brown and reddish smoke rose from a long line of well shafts. Against that backdrop stood an enormous crooked tower, at more of a slant than the tower in Pisa. It was the fake Hermes, alone and odd in desolation, rooted about a mile away. There was not a living soul in any direction. In the direction where the hills were hidden behind the sinking clouds, at the very edge of the concrete runway, was a low cylindrical building resembling a hangar for zeppelins. From its silhouette, thin mast-like spars jutted skyward, connected by glistening threads that were like a spider web spun across a quarter of the horizon. The octopus metropolis, with its single eye, had disappeared behind the smoke of the opposite horizon. Now, he thought, they were observing him by means of this spidery netting. He examined it carefully through binoculars, and was surprised by the irregularities in the mesh. The material hung unevenly, making smaller and larger openings, like an old scene draped by a giant fisherman over masts so weighed down by their own height and the netting that they bent in every direction. The appearance was sloppy. The spaceport, in any case, was deserted like an area evacuated before the arrival of an enemy, shaking off the impression, as repulsive as it was strong, that he was viewing not an antenna installation but the work of a monstrous insect. He beckoned down the ladder, stooping beneath the container he carried. It was almost 100 kilograms. He unbuckled the straps, lowered the container to the concrete, and began rolling it toward the Hermes, which rose at an angle from its shattered stern. He walked with a steady step, not hurrying, so that those who watched him, he did not doubt that there were watchers, would see nothing to make them suspicious. They knew that he would be inspecting the wreck, but not how. At the stern, the smashed jets of which stuck the radially cracked runway, he stopped and looked around. Through the helmet he heard the wind gusting, though he felt almost nothing in the suit. The peep of the chronometer called him back to business. The small folding duralumin ladder proved to be unnecessary. Right above the funnels of the jets, which were crushed into a giant accordion, a burned hole gaped in the stern. The hole had tongues of sheet metal wrenched outward, and there was a stump of a rib of the hole, twisted by the explosion. In a pinch he could crawl in through this opening, taking care not to rip his suit in the steel edges. He pulled himself up onto the foot of a landing leg that had not the time to extend completely, such was their hurry to open fire. Which move, however, made sense, since a ship was most vulnerable in the moment that it cut the main drive and shifted its entire mass onto protractile supports. Pulling the container in after him, he craned his neck as far as possible to assess the condition of the hull. From the bottom he could not see the prow hatches, which had been welded shut, but he did see the doors to the hold. To his surprise, they were locked and had not been forced. Those doors would not have let themselves be opened easily from without. Strange, having destroyed the engine room with a single heavy-caliber shot, and with the ship hit at such a tilt, why should they have entered through a radioactive hole a meter in diameter instead of propping the thing up first with a solid scaffold and then breaking into the central holds? After 100 years of war, they didn't have sappers with the right equipment. They didn't have capable military engineers? Still puzzled by the behavior of the local army, he struggled with the container, now inside the ship. He aimed at the radiometer at the darkness. The single-use reactor had melted exactly as the designers intended and flowed out through Kingston valves installed for that purpose onto the cracked concrete of the spaceport, creating a fairly small patch of radioactivity. Appreciating how nicely Polisar and Nakamura had thought the whole thing out, he turned on his flashlight. All around him it was dim and silent. Of the engine room not even rubble remained. The construction had been made to withstand the lifting of 2,000 tons of an empty mock-up, yet to fly apart at a puff of air. The needle of the Geiger assured him that in the course of an hour he would receive no more than 100 Roentgens. From the container he took 2 flat metal receptacles and dumped their contents. A tremendous number of synthetic insects equipped with microsensors. Carefully he knelt among them, as though rendering solemn homage to the broken ship, and switched on the activating system at the bottom of the larger receptacle. The swarm spilled across the warped metal came to life, haphazardly, hurriedly scrambling with their filament legs, like real beetles on their backs trying to turn themselves over. The synthecs scurried off in all directions. He waited patiently until the last ones left him. When only a couple of units, evidently defective, circled helplessly at his knees, he rose and went out into the daylight, pulling the now nearly empty container behind him. Halfway back he took a large ring from it, unfolded its stand, directed it at the stern, and returned to the earth. 59 minutes had elapsed since his landing. For the next 30 he photographed the area, primarily the high spider web, using different filters and lenses. Then he went up the ladder into the rocket. In the dark cabin the computer monitor was already on. The synthecs were reporting in the infrared through the relay set up at half distance for better coherence. Together with the computer and its program, they formed an electron microscope. The microscope was unusual only that it was separated spatially into these subunits. 10,000 of its tiny beetles rummaged through all corners of the wreck, prying into cinders, soot, dust, debris, and bits of slag and melted metal to find whatever had not been there originally. Their electronic heads were orthotropic, attracted to the high levels of molecular organization found in all living and non-living microorganisms. The beetles, too stupid themselves to make diagnoses, served only as the remote lens of the microscope analyzer in the rocket, which was already drawing the first crystal mosaics of what had been discovered and interpreting them. The technobiotic skill of the local engineers of death commanded respect. The beetles had made possible the identification in innocent refuse of slow-acting viruses. Millions of viruses lay in the guise of dirt. The computer had not yet determined their latency period. They were spores, eggs, slumbering in molecular incubators to hatch after weeks or months. From this he drew an important conclusion. He was to leave the planet in one piece, in order to carry the plague on board the Hermes. The reasoning, irreproachable in its logic, tempted him to bold action. Only by returning, after all, would he become the bearer of doom. But here a sudden doubt assailed him. The viruses could also be fraudulent. Upon discovering them, a man would have the desire, based on the deduction just now made, to attempt something reckless, and how easy it would be for someone rash and thoughtless to meet with an accident. He found himself in a situation whose structure was typical to the algebra of conflicts. A player made a model of his opponent, a model that included the opponent's model of the situation, then responded to that with a model of a model of a model, and so on ad infinitum. In such a game there was no longer any clear, reliable facts. Very tricky, he thought, devilish. Better than instruments here would have been an exorcist. The chronometer beeped in his ear. 100 minutes had gone by. He placed both hands palm down on the metal plates and felt the tingling of the current flowing in the computer, for it to send the Hermes the single-bit laser message that its scout was alive. Time now for real reconnaissance. He hurried down the ladder with the second container, and from its rear compartment pulled out a folding jeep, a light frame with a saddle and balloon tires, electrically powered. As he drove north in the direction of the mountain slopes toward sky-high netting, where the solitary hangar stood, a fine rain began to fall. A gray mist blurred and the outlines of the growling building. He stopped the open vehicle in front of it, wiped the water running down the glass of his helmet with a glove, and was amazed. The Colossus was both totally alien and incomprehensibly familiar. Windowless, with bulging walls braced by the massive parallel ribs of girders, the thing produced an impression contrary to both architecture and nature. It was like the carcass of a whale into whose belly had been shot a grenade compressed gas to make it swell hideously, while crammed inside the trusswork of a bridge until the dying body filled the entire frame. Between two ribs gaped a semicircular opening. He dropped the container from the jeep and trundled it before him through his gate to impenetrable darkness. Instantly a strong white light blazed up on all sides. He was standing at the foot of a hall in which even a giant strider would have been an ant. The hall was encircled by rows of galleries, one above the other, crooked, tangled together, an iron theater, with the stage and the seats torn out. In the center, on a perforated metal sheet, lay a multicolored starfish of flowers that gleamed like crystals. When he drew nearer, he noticed that above it hung an inverted pyramid as transparent as the air. Its surface became visible, flashing reflected light, only at a sharp angle. Deep in this glass tetrahedron appeared the emerald letters. "This is greeting." The crystalline blossoms burst into magnificent colors from azure blue to rich violet. Their radiant calyxes unfolded. Inside each was a flaming diamond. The inscription gave way to the next. "We are fulfilling your wish." He stood motionless, and the rainbow of burning crystal slowly turned gray. The diamonds glowed for a moment more, ruby red, then went out, and everything crumbled into fine ash. He stood before a barbed spool of interwoven wires, and new words shone green inside the crystal. Greeting concluded. He looked up from the dying embers and ran his eyes along the galleries, along their drooping rails. In places the galleries were detached from the concave walls. Then he jerked as if struck in the face. Suddenly he understood why this bizarre building was so familiar. It was an inside-out replica, expanded 100-fold, of the Hermes. The galleries exactly mimicked the scaffolding that had been welded to the ship's sides during the assembly and afterward mangled in the explosion at the moment of its landing, and the ribs indented in the facade were the ship's ribs, now girdling its everted hull on the outside. The lights beneath the twisted balconies went out one by one until darkness returned, and only the sign "Greeting concluded," suspended in mid-air, shone a gradually dimming apple green. What now? Having penetrated the wrecked ship, they copied it with mindless precision, or with subtle mockery, so that he would enter it as if walking into the belly of a slain, gutted animal. Whether this was the work of a gloating treachery, or instead the ritual of a non-human culture actually thus displaying hospitality, his mind remained in a labyrinth that had no exit. Stepping back into the blackness, he bumped into the container, which toppled over with a loud crash. The noise both sobered and intimidated him. At a run he wheeled the load toward the daylight and out into the rain. The wet concrete had darkened. In the distance, silver through the drizzle, stood the needle of his rocket. Dirty columns of smoke issuing steadily from the red fire pots, joined to form a low, turbid bank of clouds. Alone over the whole waste, a dead slanting tower jutted the Hermes. He checked the time. There remained almost an hour of the second 100 minutes. He struggled to clear his head of anger, to be deliberate, calm. If they had designed machines of combat, had planned military operations, done engineering on the planetary scale and in space, then they had to be able to reason logically. If they did not want to show themselves, they could at least direct him with signposts to where their terminals would prove to him, using the code that had been transmitted for months now, using equations of the algebra of conflicts, that communication was pointless. They could repudiate the arguments of superior force with practical, rational arguments, or appeal to a higher authority, which would give them a choice at least between different forms of annihilation, but there were no signposts, no terminals, no devices for the exchange of information, nothing, less than nothing, considering the metallic smokescreen in the clouds, or the corpse of their ship contaminated with a hidden plague, or its swollen copy, like a frog inflated to death by a lunatic, made to serve as a shrine of hospitality, or the crystal flower bed welcoming him by turning to ashes. A ceremony full of contradictory meanings, as if to say, "There is nothing here for you intruders. You will wrest nothing from us by your fire or falling ice, but traps, deceptions, and camouflage. Your envoy can do what he likes. Everywhere he will be met by the same stony silence, until, forced to part from his expectations, bewildered and defeated, he flies into a muddled rage, begins blasting at whatever is at hand, and buries himself beneath tumbling ruins, or crawls out from under them and departs skyward, not with knowledge stolen in an orderly retreat, but only in panic, fleeing. And even if he could in fact force anything, strong-arming his way into locked places, into the iron reaches of the one-eyed metropolis beyond the walls of smoke, surely in such alien, non-human surroundings, the harder he struck, the less he would learn, unable to distinguish between what was discovered and what was destroyed. The rain fell. The clouds settled lower, enveloping the tip of the wrecked Hermes. From a compartment in the container he took a biosensor, an instrument so sensitive that at 500 meters it registered strongly the cellular metabolism of a moth. The needle quivered constantly above zero, showing that life here, as on Earth, was everywhere, but bacteria or pollen provided no thread of irradiance. Climbing the ladder, he extended the scope all the way and aimed it at the smoke columns to the south, at the structures of the branching metropolis hidden behind them. The sensor still quivered weakly near zero. He increased the focal length to the greatest range. The smoke, though metallic, presented no obstacle, nor did walls, but when he swept the horizon with a biometer, the arrow did not move. A dead city of iron? This was so hard to believe that he automatically gave the instrument a shake, as if it were a watch that had stopped. It was only when he turned around and directed the scope at a high spiderweb, blurring through the wet rain, that the arrow began to flutter back and forth. Moving the scope to the sides made the arrow jump erratically. He jogged back to his jeep, set the container behind the saddle, struck the biosensor with a two-pronged holder by the steering wheel and drove the foot of the netting draped over masts. It poured. Puddles of rainwater sprayed beneath his wheels. Water streamed down the pane of his helmet, blinding him, and he kept having to glance at the biosensor dial, which was jumping rapidly, according to the odometer. He had covered 4 miles and was therefore approaching the limit of the area of reconnaissance. In spite of this, he accelerated. Had it not been for the warning blinks of red from the instrument panel, he would have gone headfirst, jeep and all, into a deep ditch that from the distance had looked like a strip of black across the tarmac. Braked too sharply, the vehicle skidded, slid sideways on locked wheels until it came to rest at the edge of broken slabs. He got out to look at the obstacle. The mist made it difficult to judge distance. It gave the impression of depth. The hard plain ended abruptly in fragments of concrete. Many jutted into the air above a clayey bank. The ditch, not of even width, but nowhere spannable with the small duralumin ladder, had definitely been created by explosive charges, not long ago and in haste, which was evident from the clay, in places so ragged and overhanging that it could fall at any moment. The opposite bank, with pieces of rubble driven into the soil by explosions, rose in a wide, not too steep slope, above which loomed, through the mist, the meshes of the towering spiderweb. At large intervals along the escarpment on the other side, he could see steel cables anchored in basins, cables of gauge typically used to hold on the vertical condenser antennas that sat in a socketed base without supports. For 2 of the nearest spars, an explosion had torn out the anchors and the counterpoises. Running his eye along their heavily drooping cables, he observed some 50 meters higher the trunk of a mast with telescoping segments that, thinner and thinner, curved around at the top like an overweighted fishing rod, so that the netting, slack, sagged low. Its bottom wires almost touched the ground. As far as he could see in the mist, the slope was covered by protuberances, lighter in color than the clay, not domes of embedded tanks of liquid or gas, rather the uneven bulges of molehills, or shells of great tortoises half buried, or the caps of giant mushrooms, or were these shelters, dugouts? Overhead, the downpour and the wind rocked the meshes of the loosened spiderweb. He took the biosensor from the jeep and began playing its muzzle back and forth across the slope. The needle repeatedly leaped into the red sector of the dial, fell, and again hit maximum, impelled by a metabolism not of any microscopic infusorians or ants, but of something on the order of whales and elephants. As if whole herds were sitting on that drenched hillside. 47 minutes remained to 100. Return to the rocket and wait? A pity to waste time, and worse, it might be throwing away the element of surprise. He had a vague idea now of the rules of the game. They had not attacked, but set obstacles, so he could break his full neck if that was what he wanted. Enough thinking on the subject. With the strange feeling that this reality was less real somehow than a dream, he took from the container the gear needed to jump to the other bank. He put on the jet holsters and shoulder harness and stuck a small shovel into one of his pockets. The biosensor he strapped to his back and a knapsack. But to play it safe, first he used a gun that shot a nylon line. Aiming low at the far slope, he shot. Where'd you go? Oh. Okay. He shot, supporting the gun on his left elbow. The line, unwinding with a whistle, hit the escarpment, and the hooks caught, but when he pulled, the sodden ground yielded at the first tug. So he opened the valve. A flapping rush lifted him into the air easily, as on a training field. He flew over the dark trench with ooze at the bottom, cut the thrust, a cold gas that fluttered along his legs, and dropped to the place he had chosen, beyond a bulge that resembled, when he went over to it, an enormous misshapen loaf of bread with a rough asbestos crust. His boots slid from under him in the thick mud, but he kept his balance. It was not that steep here. He was surrounded by bulging, squat mounds the color of ashes, with paler lines where there were runnels of rainwater, an abandoned village or of a primitive African tribe in mist, or a cemetery with barrows. He pointed the biosensor taken from the knapsack at an uneven, swollen wall a foot away. The needle shook at the red maximum like a small voltmeter applied to a mighty dynamo. Holding the heavy instrument in front of him with its muzzle extended like a rifle ready to shoot, he ran around the gray crusty hump that protruded from the clay. In the clay his boots slapping left deep prints that filled immediately with dark water. He hurried up the slope from the one shapeless loaf to the next, flattened at the top. They were half again taller than he was, perfect for inhabitants the size of a man. But there were no entrances, openings, spy holes, embrasures. These could not be bunkers, completely closed, unformed, nor corpses buried in crusted graves, because no matter where he turned the sensor, life throbbed. For comparison, he directed the muzzle at his own chest. The arrow at once dropped to the middle of the dial. Carefully, so as not to damage it, he laid the biosensor aside, pulled the folding shovel from his suit's thigh pocket, and on his knees dug the pliant clay. The blade scraped against an object. He shoveled away the muck, but water rapidly filled the growing hole. He thrust in his arm to the shoulder as deep as he could reach, and groping felt horizontal branching. A root system for petrified mushrooms? No. They were thick, smooth, tubular. They were pipes, and what struck him particularly, neither hot nor cold, but warm. Out of breath, muddied, he jumped up and punched the fibrous crust with his fist. It gave elastically, though fairly hard, and resumed its former shape. He rested his back against it. Through the rain he could see more humps, shaped in the same random way. Some, close together, made twisting alleys that led higher up the slope, where the mist engulfed them. Suddenly he remembered that the biosensor was a two-way. It had a switch for either aerobic or anaerobic metabolisms. The aerobic variety he had discovered already. He lifted the instrument with its glove, wiped away the clay smeared on the glass, and moved the setting to anaerobic, and trained the scope on the rough surface. The needle began to pulse again and again in a steady rhythm. Aerobic organisms mixed with anaerobic? How could that be? On this subject he was ignorant, but then no one else probably would have been able to figure it out. Slogging through steams of mud in the downpour, he came upon more and more humps. The metabolic pulses varied in frequency. Were some sleeping inside and others awake? As if wanting to rouse the sleepers, he beat on the coarse, bloated mounds, but this did not affect the pulse. Such was his haste that he nearly fell, bumping into a taut antenna cable in one of the passageways. It stretched at an angle toward the netting of the large spiderweb invisible in the milky mist. But how long had the alarm of the chronometer been on, repeating its warning louder and louder? 112 minutes had gone by without his knowing it. Where was his head? And now what? He could have flown back to the rocket in 3 or 4 minutes, except that there was only enough gas in the tank for a 200-meter jump. 300 tops, to the jeep. But that was more than 6 miles. At least 15 minutes. Should he try it? And if the Hermes struck sooner, and its envoy perished here not as a hero, but as a complete idiot? He felt for the handle of the shovel. Not there. The pocket was empty. He had left the shovel stuck near the hole that he dug. No point looking for the thing now in this maze. He swung the biosensor with both hands and hit the rough crust, hit it until it broke, and from that rent burst a yellow-white dust as from a puffball, revealing not the eyes of beings hidden in an inner chamber, but the sheer surfaces of a deep cleft with thousands of tiny pores, like a loaf of bread cut in two by an axe with ropey raw dough at the center. He froze, his arms raised for the next blow, and the sky above him filled with an awful light. The Hermes, opening fire on the antenna masts outside the spaceport, pierced straight through the clouds. The rain instantly evaporated in white steam. A laser sun rose. In a wide radius, a thermal blast swept the entire upland slope, free of mist and clouds. As far as the eye could see, the slope was covered with throngs of naked, defenseless warts, and as the towering spiderweb and the antennas breaking fell upon him in flames, he realized that he had seen the Quintons. Come here. Hello. You see him? I don't know if we should just go ahead and start reading the next book or not that I was planning on reading. Um, I realize you might not really be able to see him that well because he actually blends in with what I'm wearing. Can you see the cat? I don't know if you could see the cat or not. Um, it's such an interesting book. Mm. You could read another book next. Um, it's just such an interesting book because it's like it just points out so many things that are so true about humanity and how so much of human nature, like people will believe that they have sincere motives, but when it comes down to it, there's so much aggression. And so it's like the war wasn't even with, like, they weren't even fighting. What they were fighting really was humans. Just greedy humans and selfish humans. Like pointlessly starting a war. It's just such a fascinating book, though. Anyway, I'm petting Nico, by the way. Okay, I'm going to end the stream. Thank you for listening.